Thanks, Malcolm. Let me begin with a story. This is of a 65-year-old lady who goes to the local clinic and sees one of the new young doctors. And after she's been in the examination room for about 2 minutes, she lets out this almighty scream and bursts out of the doctor's surgery, sort of hyperventilating, and she's staggering her way down the corridor. Well, one of the senior doctors comes and grabs her by the arm to stop her falling and says, like, what's happened, madam? And the lady says, that doctor just told me I'm pregnant. Like, I'm 65 years old, I have 3 adult children, 5 grandchildren, I cannot possibly be pregnant. Well, the senior doctor sat her down and stormed into the young doctor's room to say, did you just tell that 65-year-old lady that she's pregnant? And the young doctor said, yes, I did. And the senior doctor said, what are you, stupid? You can't go around telling 65-year-old ladies that they're pregnant, particularly when they come in for something completely unrelated. To which the young doctor said, and does she still have the hiccups? Well, our passage today includes a story of another 65-year-old lady to whom God says, you're going to have a baby with your 75-year-old husband. And let me tell you, Abraham and Sarah were every bit as shocked by this revelation as the lady was in that joke. But God didn't tell them that they were going to have a baby for something as tiny as curing your hiccups, okay? He had a much more important task at hand, and that was to test Abraham and Sarah. To test Abraham and Sarah. Now, why would God do this? Well, look, there are 2 reasons that you conduct a test, okay? You test people to check what they know and to make them grow, right? To check them and to grow them. So take Navy SEAL training, for example. I used to think that Navy SEAL training was nothing more than, cruel and unusual punishment. That was until I learned its purpose, and its purpose is twofold. So firstly, the reason they make SEAL training so grueling is to separate the men from the boys, so to speak, to check who can actually handle the kinds of things that Navy SEALs have to handle in life and who can't. The second reason is to prepare those Navy SEALs for war, to grow them and get them ready for war. You see, I heard an interview with an ex-Navy SEAL who said that after 6 months of SEAL training, that's how long SEAL training goes for. It's not just the 12 weeks ending with Hell Week, it goes for 6 months. And after 6 months of the most grueling training known to mankind, when they get into a war zone and bullets are flying all over the place, those SEALs know they can handle it. Right? If they've handled the hell of SEAL training, they can handle war. And this is why God tests people. He doesn't test people to check if they'll make the cut or not. He already knows that, all right? Because God is not tied to time like you and I are, he knows the outcome of the tests before they even begin, okay? No, the reason God tests people is to make them stronger. And in Hebrews chapter 11, you see, Hebrews chapter 11 is bookended by this particular word. It comes up in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 32, and Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, and it is the word persevere. Or in Hebrews 10:32, it's stand your ground. Now, in the Greek, it's the word hypermeno, all right? So hyper, where we get the word hyperactive or hypothermia from, and meno, which means to stand. And so the reason the author gives us this big list of heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11 is because he wants to help his readers to hyperstand, right? To plant their 2 feet and not be knocked over. Be strong enough to not be knocked over by any wind, wave or current that life may throw at us. And the section we're covering today looks at a series of tests that God gives Abraham to help strengthen him so that he would go on to become the father of all who have faith as he's called in Romans 4:11. And here's the thing, if we can tap into what God is teaching us in this passage, then we too can cultivate the kind of resilience, all right, the kind of endurance, the kind of hyper standing that will make us strong enough to be able to cope with anything life throws at us. And I've got 3 points to help us build this lesson, as you can see in your sermon outline. So we're going to look at what God's tests look like, that's verses 8 to 12, where God's tests are aimed at, that's verses 13 to 16, and how God's tests are passed, verses 17 to 22. All right, so we already know the why of God's tests. It's to make us strong. The passage we're looking at today is looking at the what, the where, and the how of God's tests. And if you would like the kind of resilience that can help you handle any sort of metaphoric war zone that you might endure in this life, then please come with me as we look at what God's tests look like, where God's tests are aimed, and how God's tests are passed. And it's worth noting that the word test doesn't actually come up in this passage until verse 17. But what God is doing in verses 8 to 12 are also a list of tests. So you see this in verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. All right, now, God's tests, they're not designed to sort of grow physical strength or our sporting ability or our intellect. All right, they're designed to grow our faith. And they grow our faith by asking something of us that looks really stupid. When I was working as an engineer, the department I worked in were full of clowns, and they got this special stamp made up. Do you remember when, back in the day, if you faxed something, you'd stamp it with faxed or you'd stamp it with copy? Well, they got a stupid stamp made up. Just said stupid. And so if you made a mistake in a report or a memo, it would get a stupid stamp. It's like, try again, sunshine. All right? Here's the thing. Every single one of these requests that God makes of Abraham looks like it should get the stupid stamp. So, firstly, God says to Abraham, I want you to leave your home. Like, imagine God coming to you and saying, all right, I want you to pack up everything you own and leave Sydney. And we go, all right, well, that's a big thing, God, but yeah, sure. Where do you want me to go? Oh, I'm not telling. I just want you to get all your belongings and start walking with all your stuff, and I'll tell you when you get there. All right? Stupid stamp. Second, when God says to Abraham, actually, you've arrived at your new home now, you can stop and set up camp, and Abraham looks around and he says, but there are people already living here with big cities and big armies. Like how am I supposed to make a home when someone else already owns it? And God says, oh, sorry, I forgot to tell you, I'm not giving you this land to you or your descendants for another 500 years. I just want you to live as nomads. Stupid stamp. Then God tells Abraham, you're going to have a child with Sarah. So poor Abraham, you can imagine him, he's like, look, honey, we're at that age now when, when you bend over to do your sandals up, you sort of look around and see if there's anything else we can do while we're down here, okay? Well, God said we need to start trying to have a baby. That gets a stupid stamp. But then comes the final test down in verse 17. Once they actually have a child, now mind you, it took 25 years, okay? They didn't have a baby until Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. But after waiting 25 years, they then have a baby, and then after when he's around age 10 or 12, God asks Abraham to sacrifice their son as a burnt offering. All right, that gets 2 stupid stamps, doesn't it? But this is how God tests people to make them grow. He puts situations before them that look utterly stupid and asks them to trust him. Do what he says. So look, God tests teenagers these days. by saying to them, even though most of your friends are probably having sex before marriage, I want you to trust me when I say there are lifelong consequences for becoming one flesh with someone you're not married to. So I want you to wait for your wedding night. He tests young adults by saying, even though most of your church friends have paired up and got married and there are no good Christian guys or girls left, I want you to trust me when I tell you that no marriage is way better than marriage to a non-Christian. And so I want you to wait. Maybe forever. He tests young couples by saying, look, even though I know you want to break into the housing market, and it looks like your offertory is holding you back from that, I want you to trust me when I say that I will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness, 2 Corinthians 9 verse 10, not the harvest of your investments. He tests pregnant people by saying, look, even though your sonogram has shown that you are pregnant with a special needs child, I want you to trust me when I say that killing that unborn baby is significantly worse than raising it, as hard as that's going to be. And he tests seniors by saying, look, even though society says, look, relax, retire, and just sit back and enjoy yourself, God says, I want you to trust me that you being of no use to society is you being of no use to me. Right? There is no retirement in the Bible. And so use your extra hours for ministry. Friends, whenever we're presented with a situation in life that just looks stupid, and everything about that situation says obeying God is stupid, that's God testing us. Now, he's not testing us to see whether we'll pass or fail, all right? God's tests are not like an exam, all right? His tests are like Navy SEAL training. They hurt like hell. But they're there to make us strong, to make us hyperstand. So, that's what God's tests look like. The next question is, where exactly are they making us stronger? Where are God's tests aimed at? And the author tells us this in verse 13. Have a read with me over the page. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. So, the things that were promised to Abraham were land, descendants, countless descendants, and blessing, all right? And those promises were then to pass down through Isaac and then Jacob, who are mentioned in verse 9. And what the author is doing here is he's reminding us that these people received almost none of those promises. All right, they received none of the land except a little burial plot when they die. Abraham had one descendant. Isaac had two. It wasn't until Jacob that he started to get a lot of descendants, but it was nowhere near as big as a nation. He only had 12 sons and a daughter. All right, and they were materially blessed. We read that in Genesis, but it came alongside family disaster after family disaster. They were not blessed all over. So how is it that they stayed faithful to God through all these hardships that God threw at them? Well, it's because they realised that most of God's promises are not for this life. I'll say that again. Most of God's promises are not actually for this life. We see it in verse 14. Read it with me. People who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they'd left, they would have had an opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. And what this is saying is God's tests are aimed at what our hearts desire most, what our hearts are looking forward to most. All right? So we're surrounded by desires in this world, and all those desires compete with each other. So what do I mean? Take, for example, if you wanted to become a great musician, all right, it means you can't spend 5 hours a day watching TV or playing video games or going to soccer training. You need to spend 5 hours a day practicing your musical instrument. Right? All our desires compete with one another. And so what we have to do instinctively as humans is we pick one desire that becomes central to our life, to which all our other desires submit. All right? See, all humans have one thing of which we say only. If only I got married. If only my career would get to this level. If only I could get more followers on social media. Now, the problem is this. If our one thing, and everyone has a one thing, if our one thing is an earthly treasure, then it makes us weaker. Why? Because it fills your life with drivenness to achieve it, anxiety if it's threatened, and despair if it's taken from you. See, the thing about earthly treasures is they're always under threat. And so you're always working, or you're always worried, or you're always wrecked over them. But here's what makes it even worse. Even if you actually do achieve your earthly treasure, you will end up being unbearable and miserable because we realise that this one thing doesn't actually bring the fulfilment and the satisfaction in life that it promised us. All right? There is nothing positive about idolatry, nothing positive about making your one thing something of this world. And so what God does is he throws tests at our one thing to try and dislodge it from the centre of our heart and replace it with something better. All right? This is Colossians 3, 1 and 2. It says this: "Since then you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above and not on earthly things." All right? And that's how the patriarchs were able to hyperstand amidst disaster after disaster. They had their heart set on things above. Right? They didn't care about earthly land. Right? If it was land they wanted, they could have gone back to where Abraham was born. We saw that in verse 15, because there was plenty of land and it was family land. But instead, their one thing was a better country, verse 16, a heavenly one. Now, how does this make us strong? All right? Well, it's because the level to which you realise how much you own is the level to which you don't care what you lose. What do I mean by that? I was talking to my 9-year-old during the week, and she said, "I really want to do this thing, Dad. If you let me do this thing, I'll give you $5. And I'm like, "You don't even have $5, honey." She says, "Yes, I do." And I said, "Well, I don't need $5, sweetie. Like, $5 is not that important to an adult." All right, Tim Keller puts it this way. Imagine you lose $500. You lose your wallet. It's got $500 in it. All right, that is not going to bother you very much if you know you have millions in the bank. See, God aims his tests at our one thing, whether it's our sex or our money or our power. It's different for everyone. He aims it at our one thing to remind us to fix our heart on things above, on our heavenly country. And he does that because earthly treasures are always under threat. And they will be taken from us one day. But if we remember that we have millions in the bank, I mean, yes, it will hurt if our earthly treasures are threatened or taken, but it won't crush us. Why? Because like the patriarchs, our hearts are set on things above, on our heavenly country. Well, this leaves one last question. How do we get this strength to hyperstand? All right? How are God's tests passed so that we actually grow stronger? Well, I'll tell you how not to pass God's tests, all right? You don't pass God's tests by failing to even sit the exam. You see, there are some Christians who won't even let themselves be tested by God. What I mean is, as soon as they're confronted with a difficult situation in life, a difficult choice in life, they immediately say, oh, God couldn't possibly be asking something that stupid of me. And so they ignore it. So, for example, some Christians, believe it or not, some Christians struggle with same-sex attraction. And some of those Christians fail to even sit the exam. They say, look, God wants me to be true to myself and to be a practicing homosexual. Or how about when we see a homeless person on the street? You know, some will sit there and go, oh, look, if I give them money, they'll just spend it on alcohol. And so I'm not even going to bother stopping to ask if there's something else I can give them. I'm not even going to sit the exam. Now, the problem with dismissing God's tests outright is he's no longer our God then. We don't have a relationship with him. See, the thing about a relationship is there's toing and froing. There's pushing back on one another. You need to be able to push back on each other. And so if you won't even allow God to push you with his tests, then you don't have a relationship with him. You don't have a God. All you've got is your one thing. Now, the way you pass God's tests, and this is the pivot on this whole sermon, the way you pass God's tests is to remember that God is actually for you, even when it doesn't look that way. Right? So we see this in Abraham's final test in verse 17. Like I said before, it deserves a double stupid stamp. So to begin with, it's a request for murder, which is one of the 10 Commandments. All right? Now, the interesting thing is that the author to Hebrews, along with Genesis 22, where we find this episode, doesn't even mention the ethics of murder. Right? That's not even the most important thing. That's sort of pushed to the side. There's something even more crazy going on, because you see, God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you countless descendants through your son Isaac. Now go and kill Isaac. All right? Double stupid stamp, right? But not for Abraham. See, Abraham says, you know what? Every time I have thought that God's ideas were stupid, it actually turned out that I was the stupid one. Right? So, for example, when God said, go to this foreign country and I'll bless you and protect you, I became afraid of the people. And so what I did was I told them all that my wife was actually my sister, because I didn't want them to kill me to take my beautiful wife. But what ended up happening was a powerful king just came and took her anyway as his wife. And I got the stupid stamp. And then, when God said, you and Sarah are going to have a child, after waiting 15 years, we decided to take matters into our own hands. And so what I did was, I married my wife's maidservant, Hagar, and we had a child through them. But as a result, I had to then send that wife and my son away because of the massive family issues it caused. And I got a stupid stamp right in the middle of my forehead for that one. So you know what? Not this time. This time I'm going to obey God, even though everything about it looks stupid. And I'm going to trust that he has a plan. That's what verse 19 is getting at. It says that Abraham reasoned. He was thinking it through. He's going, well, something's got to be going on here. God must have a plan. Maybe that plan is to bring Isaac back from the dead, even though it had never happened in history up until that point before. Now, as we, the readers, know, God did have a plan, and that plan was to stop Abraham at the last minute. And the outcome of this test was that Abraham was reminded that Isaac is not his one thing. You see, Abraham had longed for an heir his whole life. When God appeared to him in Genesis 15, Abraham said to him, "Look, what can you possibly give me, God, because I don't have an heir?" Having an heir, a son, was his one thing. And God's test was aimed at showing Abraham that even getting an heir won't satisfy him. Only God can. And Abraham passed God's final test by recalling that God has always been for him. Brothers and sisters, you and I have an even greater reason to know this. All right? We don't even have to recall all those times that we thought God was against us only to find he was for us. We have the ultimate proof that God is for us. You see, some 2,000 years after Abraham climbed that mountain with his son Isaac, another son climbed the exact same mountain. You see, the mountain that Isaac was about to be sacrificed on was the mountain where Jerusalem was later built. And like Isaac, Jesus carried the wood for his execution on his back up that mountain. Yet unlike Isaac, God didn't stop the execution of his son at the last minute. God's plan was for Jesus to be sacrificed, killed. Why? As an atonement for our sins. All right? To pay the penalty for our sin, God gave up his one thing. His only beloved son. And friends, that's how we hyperstand. Right, so step one is to recognise that when difficult times cross our path, that's God testing us. Step two, we question whether there may be some earthly treasure that I'm hanging on to a little too hard, a little too tightly, that God is trying to dislodge from the centre of my heart. And step three, we remember, actually, God is for us. And even if this difficult situation has come about because of the sin of someone else, God is still going to use their sin to bring about our good. All we need to do is to remember that God is for us and that we will get the stupid stamp if we disobey. Right, friends, that's the kind of Christians God wants. Christians he can be proud of. Have a look at verse 16. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. So, friends, may we pass God's tests by allowing him to push back at us in those areas that he knows we need. For if we do, then we will build the strength to hyperstand against anything this world throws at us.